The Apple Cart and the Fox. In a certain land, in a certain wood, in a certain house there lived a young, weeping wife. Her soup always tasted of tears, the cuffs of her dress were always slightly damp, and her home always rang with the sound of sniffles, until one day a great owl perched on the sill of a window. Its weight bent the whole house back, and she fell forward, bruising her knees in the sudden lurch of movement. Swiftly, she gathered herself and went to see what the animal had wanted. Instead, it was the owl who asked her, "Why do you weep? Is your husband dead?" "No," she replied. "He is a hunter, strong, hale, and healthy." "Why do you weep? Is your father dead?" "No, he is a carpenter, strong, hale, and healthy." "Why do you weep? Is your child dead?" "Oh, great owl, I have no child. That is why I weep," she answered. She began to cry again when the owl shouted, "Stop that racket now! Stop this instant! Listen to me instead, and I will lead you." Then it turned its head twice around to see the future not yet past, then twilled in excitement for what it saw. It told her, "Go to the top of the southernmost hill and wait until dawn. There, an empty cart will roll by without a master. You are to grip the handles of it tight and force the cantankerous thing to the market in a 3-knife land and a 3-knife tsardom. Along the way, you must stall at every apple tree and have them relieve their heavy burdens onto you. And then you will have a child whose cheeks are as red and rosy as the sweetest apple." She bowed exceptionally low and set out to leave, but before she could go far, the owl called out to her, "Be warned, you must tell no one of this task, nor let go of the cart. But most of all, you must not lose a single apple in your possession." And sure enough, it was as the great owl said. The cart rolled over the southernmost hill at dawn, and there she grabbed it. It bucked and bucked and bucked, but still she persisted along the path of the orchard. The apple trees, for their part, were happy to send apple upon apple to her, until the cart was rather heavy to push, much less fight. She begged the cart, "Oh, stop, please stop," but it would not. It was this chatter that drew a fox's attention and ironed her and a redfoot horde. The fox was quickly filled with jealousy, for he was much too fat to climb the trees, and too unlovable to be gifted even a nibble. He turned to the mites on his coat and bid them to listen to her more closely. The mites flung to her dress and crawled under the folds of her clothes and waited. They were there when the cart had tried to pull past one of the trees. She had to dig in her heels to stop it, almost pulling apart her boots entirely. Once more she begged the cart, "Oh, stop, please stop. If I do not gather all the apples on this path, or lose one, I'll never have a child whose cheeks are as red and rosy as the sweetest apple." Hearing this, the mites were satisfied, and after giving her a bite, they reported back. The fox was intrigued, incensed, and most of all, intelligent. So he followed closely until finally a moonless, starless night fell upon them, and the wife could only barely see the trees in the darkness. The fox seized the opportunity. He scampered to her side, rubbed his head across her leg and hip like a beloved hound might. The wife jumped in fright, almost losing her grip on the still bucking cart. "Oh, what do you want?" she cried. The fox lied. "Oh, fair maiden, I only want to see to your success. I know your woes and wants well, for I am wise and clever. You've done very well. Those apple in your carts are so lovely, so red and ripe, so many. Surely you'll have a child with cheeks as red and rosy as the sweetest apple. But only red? Surely a little green wouldn't hurt. I just saw a green apple tree a few steps back." At that, she stopped in her tracks, then swung the cart around to go back. The cart, furious at its rough handling, bucked more and more, pushing and pulling her back in a bid to be released, or at the very least have its protest known. It was in that commotion that the fox did strike. It leapt atop the cart and trapped the plump foot in its maw, then ran off into the woods. Now her cheeks were red. Fiercely she kicked at the cart and yelled at it, "Listen here, cart, I will beg no more. We are going to the market together. As soon as we catch that horrible fox, you are to obey me, else I take up an axe and chop you down for firewood." Only then did the cart stop, frozen in fright. She was then able to pursue the fox just as she liked. However, in the night she was lost. She could not find that slippery fox, for she could no longer see his footprints. She hadn't a clue what the fox's den might be, nor the path to the market. Just before her hopes were lost, however, did she hear a whole tree bend back from something perching upon it. It was the great owl. "Hello again, young wife. Have you faltered?" "Yes, I have, I admit, but please just listen." "Why should I? You've already failed me. Failures follow after one another." "I promise. Just as I tame the cart, I will rescue the apple. Have faith in me and my devotion." "In truth, I'm only an observer in this. Yet still, why have you stopped on my account?" "To ask you where that horrible fox has gone." It is rather dark. Very well, young wife. Climb into this tree with me, and I'll tell you what you wish to know. I'll whisper it in your ear." She had unwrapped half her fingers off the handles when she suddenly remembered herself. She then looked up at the owl and scowled in indignation. The owl laughed and laughed, but in between bellows told her, "Go east. It is where his den lies. He will not have taken a bite when you arrive. I will see you through with starlight." It then flapped its wings, sending away some folds of fabric of the night to reveal a glinting silver side beneath it. And sure enough, it was as the great owl said. She found the fox in his eastern den, with his lips wrapped around the base of the fruit, just about to swallow it whole, and so, without hesitation, she charged, hitting him with the cart, driving him back into the stony wall of his den. Magically, this did not spoil a single fruit. Quickly, and with only one hand, did she yank the apple away. The fox snarled and charged, scarring her cheek with its claw marks. Still, she managed to escape his maw and teeth, and she ran and ran and ran. The fox followed relentlessly, his horrible yowl spurring her on. She pushed the cart all night long, until at last she reached the market in a 3-night land and a 3-night stardom. And just as dawn broke as well. There, many of the market-goers leapt to her defense. Most of all, her husband. He was there by the design of fate. He was aghast to see his beloved wife in such a state, blood dried on her cheek. So he pulled back his bow, his aim was true, and the fox was shot dead. The mites fled, lest they be a part of the pelt the husband would skin for his child. And sure enough, it was as the great owl said. As soon as she pushed the cart through the borders of the market, did the apples float up to the sky, until all that was left in their place was a child, a baby, with cheeks as red and rosy as the sweetest apple. The end. This was my 1,431 word riff on a folklore or fairy tale. Or, at the very least, it's the beginning of one. I would say that it's more of an origin, all in all. A small selection in a grander piece, if you will. Think the first few lines of or paragraphs of The Tale of the Bamboo Cutter or Thumbelina. It's the story of how you get a focal character, maybe even the main character. Mine is just a bit more elaborate and self-contained for the most part. I think I circumvented a lot of the boring parts of the setup that way, but you tell me. But that, of course, does bring up the question about where does it go from here? Is the child with apple cheese going to end up being a secret moon princess or almost Amelia Frog? I don't have an answer for you because I haven't decided yet. We don't even know if it's a girl or boy. I was very purposely vague. I want options if I ever pick it up again, you see. I might even change this portion itself around. See, how I am choosing to look at it is that just because there's a published version out on the internet doesn't mean that I can't exert my dominance or change it at will. It's not like it's traditionally published at this point. It's not out of the question to expand. Either way, I'm content on how this turned out. Not only is it a very nicely written flash fiction piece, but I also got an A. An A minus, but still, it counts for something, and that something being my GPA. Yes, this was written for a class as a final assignment. It was a class focusing on folklore and fairy tales, specifically Russian folklore and fairy tales. I found myself really enjoying the class and found it very valuable, mostly because it helped me gain a more tangible grasp on fairy tales in general, specifically in the form of props function. Vladimir Prop was a folklorist who analyzed fairy tales with a very structural mindset, breaking them down into bare functions that every story has or was not to be considered a folklore or a fairy tale. He was heavily criticized by his peers for this approach, as they didn't agree with his preference of formalism. But where they saw rigid rules, I saw opportunity. I structured the apple cart and the fox with his 31 functions in mind. I, of course, didn't use all of them, getting about 20 all in all, but that's okay, as even Prop says and stipulates that you don't need all of them. But what is important is having some and having it be in the right order. They're listed 1 through 31, of course. I'll give some examples of how I utilize the functions. Number 2 and 3. Interdiction and violation, respectively. They are tied together. You can't have an interdiction and not have a violation of a sort. The owl tells her in the beginning of the story that she can't do one of 3 things, or 3 things at all. That she couldn't tell anyone of the task, she couldn't lose the cart, and she couldn't lose an apple. You might think her losing the apple is the violation part of the interdiction, but if you look closer, you'll see that it doesn't quite line up with the order, as there's a lot of the functions that come before. Take reconnaissance, for example. You have to go back and look at the part where she begs the cart for the 2nd time, and the mites overhear her. She is then in violation of the first rule mentioned, not telling anyone. You could argue that she didn't know about her eavesdroppers, but still, she told the cart. The cart, as a sentient being, was the anyone in that equation. Maybe that's a little cheap on my part, but if you really go back to some of the older fairy tales, something so small or accidental would not be unheard of a violation. The rest are a bit straightforward, too straightforward for an explanation, but one that I particularly like is the branding. A lot of female-focused fairy tales don't have this one, so I thought it'd be interesting to include it. I also felt that she gets very roughed up in this story. Her knees get bruised, she gets bit by mites, and she gets clawed in the face. I think it helps sell her struggle to accomplish her goals. It's her devotion, as she mentions. I really am proud of having it in there. But it's not all of how I used the fairy tales and even Proc's ideas. You'll notice that she's given 3 rules, that she talks to the cart 3 times, and it is as the owl says 3 times. The rule of 3 is very important in fairy tales and legends, and folklore in general. I think it helps build up a certain atmosphere to it. I also use certain formulaic sayings to aid in my search for a tone or feeling. It's not exactly once upon a time, but in a 3-night land, in a 3-night Zardom is very unique to Russian fairy tales and folklore, and at one point it was very expected to have it. You see, in my class we went over that most of these fairy tales, before they were recorded down, were spoken out loud in parties or tournaments or festivals. And sometimes when the storyteller would go up and speak on stage, he would pad out stories with these phrases to help him. There's a lot of them that I could use, but I found the one that I did to be a very nice example of it. I also didn't name any of the characters. The wife is the wife, the fox is the fox, the cart is the cart. I don't think that it's necessary to have them named, as if the story is more expanded, they're just going to be the main character's mom and dad and adversary. But it also speaks to a lot of how fairy tales are written. It was very important to keep it vague, but not to the point where it was really interesting. It was not the point it was uninteresting. But anyways, Wood Prop, a man from a completely different ethnic and cultural background than me, who died before I was born, or secretly manifested in a sentient cart, approve? No. That's something I knew going in. This was not something he would consider folklore. It might be considered a fairy tale, but that's semantics that I don't really want to get into at this point. But knowing this allowed me to just break my rules of it mostly and use my own writer's voice. And I was very happy to do so. To wrap this up, I was very happy in how I presented this, and I'm very happy how it turned out. In hindsight, I might have done some things different, but at the same time, it is the best work that I think I could have written for the class. And I'm glad it's my first impression to you. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I also hope to see you again sometime. I want to try to make enough videos for this channel to count for something. And it might not be fantasy, it might not be sci-fi, but it's going to be fictional. I'm convinced that this is my year. Thank you.